Thank you all for turning out on a Sunday morning to hear a talk about radioactivity. Normally when I give a talk like this, I have some very beautiful photographs that I show with it, but I don't have the equipment, so it'll just be me talking for the first part of this session. But if you want to interrupt at any time, just signal, and that's fine, because interaction is the most important kind of action I think we can do. What is radiation? How many people think they know what radiation is? Could you give me a little... Yes?
In the nucleus of certain products like uranium, there is a change over time at atomic level. There is some electron changes of level of energy, and this emits rays. And these rays can penetrate tissues and woods and protections, and they can damage cells.
Very good, very good. What we've heard here is a very illuminated understanding of what we're talking about, which is radioactivity. Now, radiation is not the same thing as radioactivity. I'd like to draw a distinction between them, because we have, for example, these lights are giving off radiation. It's called visible light. Heat gives off, a radiator heat gives off heat rays. And there is a spectrum, it's called an electromagnetic spectrum of radiation. It's got radio waves, television waves, visible light, and then it's got infrared and ultraviolet, which are not visible to our eyes, but which could be visible to certain types of film. And animals can see sometimes in frequencies that we cannot see. That's radiation. Now, most of our experience with radiation of that kind is something that we can control. We can turn it on. We turn the light switch off, the radiation stops. Okay? We turn it back on again, there's the radiation again. Okay? And that radiation is generally not harmful. It's not biologically harmful. Some radiation may be. For example, infrared, we know that can be very dangerous and give you bad burns and so on. But what we're talking about is on this workshop is radioactivity. And that's what we heard described. And that's what I want to make the distinction of. So let's go back to the beginning. Up until about 150 years ago, we had no idea that atoms could give off energy from rocks. The idea that a rock could give off energy of a penetrating sort was completely unknown. And Henri Becquerel was a researcher in Paris, France, and he discovered that in his drawer he had a rock that contained uranium. Uranium was an element that was discovered a couple hundred years earlier. But he had this rock in his drawer, and in the same drawer he had a photographic plate that was wrapped in black paper that allowed no light in. So he was very surprised, because this rock had been in the drawer for weeks, closed, no light coming in. When he took out the photographic plate and developed it, he saw that it had been exposed by the rock. So the rock had somehow managed to illuminate the photographic plate and expose it. And he was astonished, because although he was studying other types of materials that glowed in the dark, all those materials that he had studied required light to shine on it first, and then you would see it glow for a while afterwards, but then it would fade away, right? This was something quite different, because it was the energy was coming off of this rock, and if you can't see these emissions, these radioactive emissions, the energy that's being given off. But if you put that rock in a device called a cloud chamber filled with vapor, then you can see the tracks. And it's amazing. This rock is giving off energy like a fountain of energy in all directions, all the time. It's just going all the time. And it's going for millions and millions and millions of years. This rock, day and night, has just been giving off this energy constantly. That's radioactivity. And he was the discoverer of radioactivity. So this is quite a new experience. Now, just 3 months earlier, believe it or not, another researcher named Röntgen discovered X-rays. Now, X-rays are quite different, although they have some similarities. I'll try and explain it. What he was experimenting with was what are called cathode ray tubes. It's where you send electrical charges through an evacuated tube to a target, and you can make, this is where neon signs come from. Neon signs, they glow, but you can turn neon signs on and off, right? Similarly, with X-rays, if you shine the cathode rays, this evacuated glass tube that is glowing, what he discovered that there was a very penetrating form of electromagnetic radiation being given off, which he called X-rays, X for the unknown. He didn't know what those were either. And one of the first photographs that he ever took was of his wife's hand with the wedding ring on it. And you could see the bones because these X-rays were so penetrating that they went right through the soft tissues and were only obscured by the denser bones and so on. And this allowed you, of course, a wonderful tool to allow you to see the bone structures and to detect what might be going wrong. And dentists, of course, use it, and doctors use it, sometimes use it too much. They use CAT scans, which give off a lot of these X-rays, very high doses of X-rays, and so on and so on. So we all know about X-rays. But the thing about X-rays is that they're human-made. I mean, at least these X-rays are. So when you shut off that machine or unplug the machine, they stop. There's no more X-rays. And you plug it in again, it starts again. And when you turn off an X-ray machine, it's perfectly harmless. It's not going to hurt you at all. It's not radioactive waste, for example. Okay, that's very different from the uranium. The uranium rock has no off switch. It never stops. Nobody knows how to turn it off. Nobody knows how to slow it down. Nobody knows how to alter those emissions, which are going on all the time. And even if the uranium is chemically compounded with other things, it enters into a compound, it's still giving off those rays. And the reason why is because they come right from the very nucleus of the atom. The nucleus of the atom, think of an atom as a kind of a miniature solar system and think of the heart of the atom, that's the nucleus. And that's where that energy is coming from. That's why we call it nuclear energy. Nuclear energy comes from the nucleus of the atom. And nobody had any idea that you could tap into this energy. Well, in the case of uranium, it wasn't us tapping in, it was nature leaking it out. So nature was leaking out this energy, and it turns out that we now know, science now knows, that there are only 4 major forces in the universe, gravity, the electromagnetic force, and the 2 nuclear forces, the strong nuclear force and the weak nuclear force. And these 2 nuclear forces are the strongest forces in the universe. It's ironic that one of the tiniest things you can imagine, the nucleus of an atom, which is much, much smaller than the atom itself, that tiny thing contains the most powerful force in the universe. And of course, that's what led to the atomic bomb. Now, when scientists were puzzled and delighted to study this phenomenon, they wanted to know more about it. And somebody did a calculation, in fact, Sir Rutherford, Ernest Rutherford, who was called the Newton of atomic physics, he did a calculation of how much energy, if you added it up over 1,000 years, how much energy was coming off this uranium atom. And he said, wow, that's enough energy to destroy the Earth. But he said, but there's no way that you can tap into that energy. There's no way you can control it. There's no trigger to allow it to happen. Therefore, we just have to take what nature gives us. Now, Becquerel quite early on carried a bit of this rock in his pocket, his shirt pocket, in order to show people. And he developed a very nasty burn on his chest, a radiation burn. And this burn was really, really sore and very difficult to heal. Just 2 years after Becquerel discovered the radioactivity of uranium, Marie Curie was a chemist, a brilliant chemist from Poland, and she decided that she was going to investigate as to what was behind this. So she crushed up the rock, tons of it. She bought tons of this rock, and back-breaking labor, she crushed it all up and ground it to a fine powder, and she separated out the uranium. And sure enough, what she discovered is the uranium is, in fact, radioactive, gives off this, but the rock that she crushed up, left behind, is much more radioactive than the uranium. It's 6 times more radioactive. So she said, there must be something else there. And so she went further and she gradually removed all of the elements that were known to science. And what she was left with was two new elements that nobody ever knew existed. One of them she called radium, and the other one she called polonium. Polonium was named after her homeland of Poland. And she discovered that this radium is millions of times more radioactive than uranium. Actually, gram per gram, millions of times more radioactive. She discovered that it's extremely radioactive, and polonium is even more radioactive than radium, even. But she thought, well, you know what? If radium has the power to burn healthy skin, it would also have the ability to burn unhealthy skin. So she thought, aha, we can fight cancer. So the first use of radium was to fight cancer. She figured that if you put radium in proximity to a cancerous tumor, you could burn that tumor and it would shrink it and hopefully at least delay the onset of fatality. Maybe not a cure for cancer, but certainly a treatment for cancer. And so radium, and so the demand for radium grew under the influence of Marie Curie, who separated these elements and won 2 Nobel Prizes as a result of her work. Quite an accomplishment in those days when women were scarcely recognized. In fact, she wasn't, when they were considered her for a Nobel Prize, they didn't even include, they had Becquerel and her husband, Pierre Curie, and it was only Pierre Curie who insisted that she be included. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been even given the recognition she deserved. So fast forward now, what is the usefulness of this radioactivity? Well, there's various things that can be done with it. One of them is they found that if you mix it with certain chemicals and paint dials with it, they will glow in the dark forever. Because radium itself has a half-life of 1,200 years. What does a half-life mean? Well, now we know what's going on. And back in those days, neither Curie nor Becquerel knew what was going on, really. But now we know better. We know that what's happening here is that the uranium atom is what we call unstable. And because it's unstable, the nucleus is unstable, when it explodes or disintegrates, it gives off a kind of a subatomic shrapnel. And it's that shrapnel that damages living tissue and unhealthy tissue as well, whether it's healthy or unhealthy, and also will expose a photographic plate. So they figured, okay, there's 2 uses for radioactivity. We can use it to fight cancer, and we can use it to illuminate things. It's a kind of an invisible light. And so you can make these dials that glow in the dark. They hired thousands of girls all over the world to work in radium dial painting factories, and these girls were taught to lick the brushes to get a fine point on them because they had to do very fine work to paint these things very accurately. Radium, by the way, was a very expensive commodity. At that time, we're talking here about the 1920s. This is happening in the 1920s. Even earlier, started in the 1910s. And around that time, radium was selling for $120,000 a gram in current dollars. Like that's in dollars of that era. So you can imagine how much that would be today, right? $120,000 a gram. Now, people thought mistakenly at that time that because radium in particular, the byproduct of uranium, because radium is so energetic that it probably would be a good tonic. So they put it into candies, they put it into bottled water, they put it into butter. They sold butter that was laced with radium, and they thought that this would be very healthy for people to get this internal energy, which would charge them up like a tonic, right? And so there were all kinds of really foolish applications of this discovery. And it wasn't until the 1920s that these radium dial painters, these young teenage girls, started developing terrible problems. The first one being radium jaw. They found that their jaw bones and their teeth started becoming very damaged, and the dentists could hardly believe it. These are young girls, 14, 15, 16, 17. Their teeth were falling out spontaneously because the bones were damaged by small, tiny amounts of radium. And then they discovered that they had terrible anemia, this rapid anemia, blood disease, which killed many of them. And when they did autopsies, they found that every bone in the girl's body that they autopsied, every bone was radioactive. that they could put any one of these bones on a photographic plate in a dark room overnight, and it would take its own picture because of the radiation from the bones. Now, this is astonishing because the amount of radium in their bodies, the maximum amount of radium in any of these girls' bodies was 18 micrograms. Microgram is 1/1,000,000th of a gram. And one of the difficulties was that there's no chemical test in those days that would determine radium chemically. So if they took chemical samples, they would never find that radium was the cause of this illness. But you have to look at the radioactive emissions. So you need to detect the radiation using a radiation counter. What they had to do was they had to ash the bones and then analyze the bones in order to prove that in fact they had radium in the bones, and that was what the real root cause was. So there were a lot of legal battles over this. A couple of years later, beginning in the 30s, around the end of the 20s and beginning of the 30s, many of these women started to develop a bone cancer. One person would develop bone cancer in the hip, another person bone cancer in the chest, another person bone cancer in the foot. And so it seemed like, well, can one thing be causing all these bone cancers? And the answer is, yeah, it was radium in every case. But different bones are affected simply because of the roll of the dice. It turns out that when these emissions occur in living tissue, it damages the cells, and sometimes the cell is damaged and able to survive. Most of the time it's killed. If it's killed, the body just gets rid of it. But if it's able to survive, it might be able to reproduce. And if it's able to reproduce, then it might develop abnormally. And if it develops abnormally, then you have a cancer. And where that happens in the body is completely a matter of chance, because it just depends on random damage to certain cells. And that random damage will sometimes lead to cancer and sometimes not. So the result is that you can't say that everybody who's exposed to radiation is going to die of cancer. But you can predict how many people are going to die of cancer, and you don't know who those people are until they're detected. So now that's how we learned early on. Now what is really going on here is that when the uranium atom disintegrates, it actually changes into a new element called protactinium. It's not the same as uranium anymore. And then protactinium is also radioactive, and when it disintegrates, it gives off it turns into another new element. Protactinium is the name of an element which Marie Curie did not discover. It's very short-lived, and it quickly changes into something else, and eventually it changes into radium. So every atom of radium actually started off as an atom of uranium. So what's happening is uranium is actually transforming itself, metamorphizing into different elements, and one of those elements is radium. Okay? So every atom of radium started off as an atom of uranium. And guess what happens when radium disintegrates? It turns into a gas called radon gas. And that's where all the radon gas comes from. When you ever hear about radon gas, you've heard about that as a problem in homes and so on. Every atom of radon gas started off as an atom of uranium. It's a long decay chain. And the decay chain is how these elements transform themselves. And then, by the way, when radium disintegrates, it turns into a new element called, radon is a gas, it turns into an element called polonium. And there's 3 isotopes of polonium, polonium-214, polonium-218, and polonium-210. Now, has anybody heard of polonium-210? You have. Thank you. What connection? Polonium-210. Did you hear about it? Any particular connection?
It was somebody which was poisoned with that.
Exactly. Yes. A Russian defector named Litvinenko was poisoned with polonium-210 in London, England, by somebody, a Russian agent sent by Putin to murder him because he was critical of Putin's regime, and they poured a little bit of polonium into his tea, and he died a terrible death. It took him 3 weeks to die. The doctors were puzzled. They finally figured out that it was polonium that was killing him. His body had to be buried as radioactive waste because it had that polonium and its precursors in it as well. So polonium turns out to be, according to polonium-210, that's one of the substances that Marie Curie discovered, one of the things she discovered. It also started off as uranium. So these are all byproducts of uranium, you see. And that polonium-210, according to the Los Alamos laboratory is where they tested the atomic bomb, they say that it's 250 billion times more toxic than cyanide. Cyanide is one of the deadliest poisons known. In murder mysteries, cyanide is a rapid killer. You can poison somebody quickly. They'll die without having to wait around too long. Polonium-210 is considered to be 250 billion times more toxic. That means that a little amount of polonium-210, the size of a grain of sugar, will be enough to kill 1,000 people the way Litvinenko died. So it's very, very potent poison. And by the way, you can't get your hands on that stuff unless you're working in a nuclear program of some sort, in particular a nuclear weapons program. So let's fast forward now, because I don't want to take too much time here. But in 1938, around Christmas time, they discovered the trigger for releasing massive amounts of nuclear energy. Instead of just waiting for these things to decay and making use of them as we do, for good or for ill, right? They found a trigger, and the trigger is called the neutron. And the neutron it's a constituent of every atomic nucleus, but they found a way of generating neutrons, of producing neutrons at will. And once they learned how to produce neutrons, they could fire those neutrons at different elements and see what happens to them. And what happens with the neutrons is that because they have no charge, unlike the proton, which has a lot of charge, a positive charge, because it has no charge, it enters into another nucleus very easily. If you direct the neutron to another atom, that atom will absorb the neutron, and in many cases, it becomes radioactive, when it wasn't before. So this is a way of turning non-radioactive materials into radioactive materials. And that was done for many years. Enrico Fermi in Rome made a whole career out of firing neutrons at different materials and creating new radioactive elements that are not found in nature. And these new radioactive materials, he found that you could turn almost anything into a radioactive variety. For example, I'll give you one example. Cobalt. Cobalt is a material which is non-radioactive. It's called cobalt 59. 59 refers to the number of building blocks in the nucleus, the 59 building blocks in the nucleus. You fire a neutron at it, it turns into cobalt 60. And cobalt 60 turns out to be a very powerful emitter of gamma radiation, even stronger than X-rays. And so by just firing a neutron into cobalt 59, you can make cobalt 60. Similarly, you can make other radioactive materials. Fermi did this, went through the whole gamut of non-radioactive materials and found that you could produce radioactive varieties of almost anything. All right? But in Berlin, in 1938, around Christmas time, the researchers there did something novel. They fired neutrons at uranium. They said, if I fire neutrons at uranium, maybe I'll get an atom heavier than uranium, which doesn't exist. There is no atom heavier than uranium. In the periodic table of elements, uranium is the high point, element number 92. So they were hoping to be able to get an element heavier than uranium. But what they discovered puzzled them because they didn't understand it. And what they had done is they had actually split the uranium atom. And they had to call upon a woman, Lise Meitner, who did not get a Nobel Prize, by the way, although they did. But they called upon a woman, a chemist, Lise Meitner, who explained to them what had actually happened. What they had actually done was, instead of creating an element heavier than uranium, they had split the uranium atom and produced two elements that are lighter than uranium, the broken pieces. These are called fission products. And so this was the discovery that you can split the atom. And what was even more astonishing than that is that when the atom splits with one neutron, it gives off two neutrons. So those two neutrons can go on to split two atoms, and then that gives off four neutrons, and then so on and so on and so on. Now you could do this on a hand calculator yourself. If you multiply 2 by itself 40 times, you get an enormous number. An enormous number. You get so many zeros. You've never seen so many zeros before in your life. And that's that's what happens when you double 60 times. If you double even 40 times, you get a huge amount. But 60 times, you really get a huge, huge number. Well, that happens. That number of doublings happens in less than a millionth of a second because the neutrons are flying so rapidly. And that's the atomic bomb. That's the atomic bomb. So early on, they learned that it is possible, using this type of uranium, to get a powerful atomic bomb. And that's what led to the Hiroshima bomb, which Canada, by the way, was working on together with the United States and the United Kingdom in a secret meeting in Quebec City in 1943. Prime Minister Mackenzie King signed an agreement with Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt to develop together, the three countries, the atomic bomb, the first atomic bombs. And Canada was important because they had the uranium. And why did they have the uranium? Because they had previously had a radium mine. When the price of radium by this time had dropped from $120,000 a gram to $70,000 a gram. But it was still very lucrative. And they discovered in the Northwest Territories, way up on Great Bear Lake, and just south of the Arctic Circle, they discovered a deposit of rich uranium-bearing ore. That uranium-bearing ore was brought down to Port Hope, Ontario, and that's where the radium was being sold during the 1930s. But it was only at the end of the 1930s they discovered that uranium can be used to make a bomb, not radium. So they weren't interested in the radium anymore, they were interested in the uranium. In fact, so many people had been killed by radium at that point that there was no longer any market for radium. Everybody knew it was a killer. But they wanted the uranium for the bomb, and guess what? Radium is a byproduct of uranium. So anywhere you find radium, there's bound to be uranium there. And so what they had down in Port Hope, Ontario, was they had tons and tons and tons of sandy materials left over full of uranium that was discarded because they were selling radium. And they said, why don't you reprocess that waste to get the uranium out, and we can use the uranium to build the world's first atomic bomb. So that's how Canada became involved. Now, this is going on a little long, so let me fast forward now to what we're now faced with, okay? What we're faced with now is the fact that nuclear reactors have been built all over the world. There's about 400, less than 500 of them around the world. There's about 100 in the United States. There's about 20 in Canada. And these reactors use uranium, splitting uranium atoms to produce energy. Enormous energy is released when you split the uranium atoms, and you can use that energy to boil a lot of water to get an enormous amount of steam, and that steam can be used to spin the wheels of a turbine and generate electricity. And that's how we get our electricity from nuclear reactors. Now, for the first 30 years of the nuclear age, from 1945 to 1975, nobody was told by the nuclear industry that we have a problem of radioactive waste. Because while the atoms are being split, all of these byproducts, these broken pieces of uranium atoms, they turn out to be, collectively, millions of times more radioactive than uranium itself. So a fuel bundle is about the size of a fireplace log. You can handle it safely before it goes into the reactor because it's only uranium that's in there. And the radiation from uranium is not going to hurt you if you handle it with gloves and handle it for a very short period of time. You know, if you stay there a long time, you live there, then it's going to harm you. But if you just simply handle it briefly, no problem. However, when that same fuel bundle comes out of the reactor, it'll kill any human being within 20 seconds at a distance of 1 meter, unless they're very carefully shielded. So it gives off a blast of gamma radiation that will kill any human being when it comes out of the reactor, because there are hundreds of new radioactive materials that have been created inside the fuel by splitting those uranium atoms. And most of these things are actually broken pieces of uranium atoms. So I have a chart in my, on my website which lists 211 of these, and that's not a complete chart. And they have names like iodine-131, cesium-137, strontium-90, and they all have different pathways through the environment, and they all have different pathways through the human body. For example, iodine goes to the throat, it goes to the thyroid gland. Back up a little. Iodine is a non-radioactive material. Iodine is found in nature. It's not radioactive. Also, strontium is non-radioactive. You find it in soil. Cesium is not radioactive. It's a constituent of soil also. But what the nuclear reactor does is it creates radioactive varieties of these non-radioactive elements. So now all of a sudden we have radioactive varieties of these things. And that causes enormous damage to people. After the Chernobyl accident, cesium-137, radioactive cesium, very unlike the non-radioactive cesium that we have, was spread far and wide. And for 20 years after the Chernobyl accident, sheep farmers in Wales and northern England had to stop selling their sheep for human consumption because of contamination with cesium-137 from that nuclear reactor in Ukraine, the Chernobyl nuclear reactor that exploded and spread radioactive. So this is a problem. When the nuclear enterprise was launched and when billions of dollars were spent to build these reactors, nobody was told that this was a problem, nor that they didn't really have a solution for it. But as soon as they were caught with their pants down, as it were, in other words, they were discovered in the mid-1970s, it was revealed through a number of reports in England, in the United States, and in Ontario, Canada, and elsewhere in the world. It was, hey, the alarm bells went off and said, did you know that we have this problem? These radioactive wastes are going to remain dangerous for more than 10 million years. And what's more, they're so radiotoxic that we don't have enough fresh water in the whole world that would be enough to dilute this waste to safe drinking levels. They have what are called regulated safe drinking levels, okay, for radioactive materials, how much you're allowed to have in a liter of water. Not recommended, but the maximum allowable. And in Ontario, they had a Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning, which I participated in, called the Porter Commission. And they calculated that if you just took one CANDU reactor, such as the one at Point Lepreau, and you took 1 year's worth of spent fuel, that's the used nuclear fuel that comes out of it, how much water would you need just to handle that amount of used fuel if you wanted to, and this is a mental exercise, nobody's going to do this, but mentally, how much water would you need to dissolve all of that material to the point of the maximum level of contamination allowed by law for drinking water? And the answer is Lake Superior. It's about the size of Lake Superior. That's how much water you would need to dilute just 1 year's worth of spent fuel from one CANDU reactor. Now you think about 20 nuclear reactors, and you think about 30 years of operation, you get 600 Lake Superiors. We don't have 600 Lake Superiors, right? So that's the problem. The problem is that we have to keep this stuff that we've created in these nuclear reactors out of the environment of living things for periods of time that dwarf the span of human history. The pyramids of Egypt are only 5,000 years old. That's not nearly long enough. Plutonium, which is one of the things created inside the nuclear reactor, has a half-life. I haven't explained half-life. Half-life, for any radioactive material, the atoms are disintegrating. As they disintegrate, they're changing into other materials, correct? Well, the time it takes for half of those atoms to disintegrate is called the half-life. In the case of plutonium, it's 24,000 years. So whatever amount of plutonium you have today, 24,000 years from now, you'll have half as much. But the other half hasn't disappeared. It's changed into something else. And guess what? It's changed into another radioactive material, which has a 600 million year half-life. So it's very complicated because these things don't just disappear. And people get the wrong idea sometimes that when something disintegrates, it's simply gone. No, it's not. So what we have is a permanent problem, not only for the human race, but for all living things, really. And we have if we want to be stewards of the environment or stewards of the planet, this beautiful planet that we have, that's the only planet in the solar system that supports advanced life, at least, then what are we going to do with this stuff? Now, the nuclear industry said, oh, yes, the nuclear waste, right. We didn't mention that because we know what to do with it. And we have the solution. And the solution is we just dig a hole and we put it down deep where it'll never come back to bother people. And so that's the job done, right? And they've been working ever since to try and find a hole deep enough and strong enough to contain this material for more than 10 million years and to prevent it from leaking out. It turns out that we don't really have the knowledge, sufficient knowledge, to be able to guarantee that this is going to be working properly, because nature is a great recycler. It's very good at recycling things. And this waste is not inert. It's not like just any old rock. It's radioactive. And the result is it's causing chemical reactions underground. One of the things that radioactivity does, those radioactive emissions, one of the things they do is they break chemical bonds. That's how they damage living cells. And breaking chemical bonds means you create ions. Ions are electrically charged fragments of broken molecules. Those are called ions. And for this reason, it's called ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation is radiation that creates these electrical broken bonds, right? That creates a lot of chemical reactions going on, which are unpredictable chemical reactions, by the way. And because, you know, who is going to figure all that out? You can't. It's random. These are random breakages. Now, it also gives off heat. In fact, the heat, just from the radioactivity alone, here's an astonishing thing. If you took any reactor in the world that's operating right now today, and you simply shut it down, stop the reaction from occurring, and stop all the flow of cooling water, and just walk away from it, what will happen? It turns out it won't necessarily explode, but it will melt. It'll melt. And why does it melt? It melts because you can't shut off the radioactivity. You can turn off, by stopping the neutrons, you can stop the chain reaction, but you can't turn off the radioactivity. And so the result is that that radioactivity is a form of energy, and energy turns into heat, and heat builds up the temperature. And if you don't cool it, if you don't keep cooling it, that temperature is going to go up to the melting point, which is about 2,800 degrees Celsius, 2,800 degrees Celsius, which is approximately twice the melting point of steel. So at that point, when the fuel, the uranium fuel starts melting, the uranium fuel bundles release all those radioactive materials which are inside that we call radioactive waste, and that's what comes out of the reactor following an accident. You know, when you think about a Chernobyl accident or a Fukushima accident, where did all this radioactive stuff come from? It was always there. It was created inside the reactor. It's just waiting to get out. And normally it doesn't have the opportunity to get out. But if it overheats and melts, then game over. Now it's out, right? And luckily they were able to contain a surprisingly large percentage of the radioactivity at Fukushima. And so the amount that escaped is just a fraction of what's there. And, you know, I don't know if you know this, but for 20 years after, well, for 10 years at least, after the Fukushima meltdown, triple meltdown, they had to pump about 400 tons of water every day down into the molten core of the reactor underground and pump that water back up to the surface. And when it came back to the surface, it was extremely radioactive. And so they built tanks. They built 1,500 tanks, each one containing 300 tons of contaminated water. And they had to do that. Why? Because the heat is still being generated by the radioactivity. You have to keep cooling it. Even under normal circumstances, when you take the fuel out of a nuclear reactor, you have to put it in a pool of circulating water for at least 5, 6, 7 years. In Canada, it's 10 years usually. And then you can take it out and put it in dry storage, but it's still being cooled by the air circulation. And you can't put it underground until it's at least 30 years old because too much heat is being generated. It will heat up. Once you seal the underground cavity, that heat builds up and there's nowhere for it to go. And so it actually heats up the rocks. It takes, according to Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, it takes about 50,000 years for the underground rocks to return to the normal temperature after you bury this radioactive waste. So you can see that there's a problem there. Now, I'm not going to go on very much longer. I'm just going to say that what does this mean for New Brunswick? Well, what it means for New Brunswick is that the age of nuclear waste is just beginning. The age of nuclear waste is going to stretch out before us longer than we can imagine, way longer than we expect human civilization even to survive, you know. And so we have created a problem of enormous proportions. And we want to do the best thing possible for that. It's going to cost a lot of money, it's going to take a lot of ingenuity, and it's going to take a certain amount of humility. You can't go into this in a boastful fashion and think that you're able to solve this problem lickety-split. I also forgot to mention that while the reactor is operating, it's giving off a lot of neutrons. They're flying all over the place. These neutrons are hitting non-radioactive materials in the concrete and the steel and the building materials around the core of the reactor. So even when you take the irradiated fuel out with all those broken bits of uranium atoms in them, you still have radioactive structures left behind. That's called decommissioning. You have to dismantle that radioactive structure. I just read a report from 1986 saying that they hope to be able, for the most radioactive portions of the structure, they're hoping to be able to flood the structure with water and send divers in with underwater cutting torches, underwater plasma cutting torches, to use the same kind of techniques they use on sunken vessels to be able to salvage. And the water will help to protect the workers from radiation exposure, while also it will also trap a lot of the dust that would be released by cutting. Otherwise it'll go into the air, right? And so they're working away on this. It's not as if they're not working away on this. It's not as if they're not well-intentioned. But the question is, do they really have the answer? They have ideas, they have technology. Some of them are quite brilliant, not necessarily reliable. So we've had already 3 failures of underground repositories, and this has humbled some people, not all. In Germany, they put much lower level radioactive waste, not the irradiated fuel, not the high level waste, low level radioactive waste, into a deep underground repository called the acid 2 repository. And that was done over a period of decades. And for 10 years, this material, radioactive material, was leaking into the groundwater, contaminating the groundwater underground. And the government was not told about this until it had been going on for about 10 years. When the government learned about it, they decided, after investigating, they decided they had to get that waste out again. They have to send people down and retrieve that waste, bring it back to the surface. They have nowhere else to put it, but they'll figure that out later. But they have to get it out from underground because it's doing too much damage down there. And it's going to cost at least $5 billion, and it's going to be very dangerous, and it's going to take about 30 years to get it back to the surface again. So that is only one of 3 failures we've had in the last 15 years of underground repositories. So my organization is advocating that we not abandon this waste, because the idea of putting it underground is that they can walk away from it. The idea is we can put it underground, bury it, and then we can just wipe our hands and walk away. And in fact, we have the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission gives a license to abandon. They have a license to operate, a license to build, and they have a license to abandon. Well, when they abandon it, it means that it's no longer our problem. It's somebody else's problem. And we don't believe that that's an ethical or scientifically correct way to proceed. Remember, these wastes are only 80 years old. I'm 85 years old. These wastes are about 85 years old. So I'm the same age as these nuclear wastes. They haven't been around for thousands of years. We shouldn't be in a rush to bury them and abandon them. We feel that it should be something called rolling stewardship, where it's an intergenerational problem to look after these wastes and make sure that they're kept out of the environment of living things in the most secure way possible. And that means repackaging things as they go along, fixing leaks. If these things start to leak, we need to have it where we can retrieve the waste, where we can access the waste, monitor the waste, and repair it. Because we do know how to contain it for periods of time, hundreds of years perhaps at a time. But we don't know how to abandon it and just forget it. We don't know how to do that. So we're advocating that until the nuclear age comes to an end, we should not think about abandoning this waste, but think about rolling stewardship. Thank you very much. Any questions? We have time for some questions here.
We have a lot of radon in New Brunswick. People fear that they will try to come and dig for our uranium.
Not so long ago, around the time that they enacted a ban on fracking in New Brunswick, they were also exploring for uranium. And there was not as strong an opposition to that, but there was also opposition to that. The trouble with uranium mining is that, as I told you, uranium is never alone. Uranium has all of its decay products with it. So when you bring uranium to the surface, you're bringing all that other stuff, the radium, the polonium. 85% of the radioactivity is left behind in the waste. Only 15% of the radioactivity is taken away in the form of uranium. So uranium mining leaves the worst of the radioactive materials for the population and for the environment, and takes away only that portion of the radioactivity which they want to use. So that's the problem. Now here in New Brunswick, some progress was made towards at least limiting the exploring for uranium, keeping it away from cities, keeping it away from wells and so on, that sort of thing. But they didn't declare a moratorium. In British Columbia, they have declared a moratorium on uranium mining, a permanent one. In Quebec, they have been advised to have a moratorium, and they are, in fact, not pursuing uranium exploration in Quebec. They did have a law in Nova Scotia up until last year, or 2 years ago, was it? 2 years ago. They had a law against uranium exploration and mining, but now that law has been overturned. He went down for the Trump inauguration, so he's a politician from Nova Scotia. He just flipped that law and threw it out the window. So unfortunately, they had a protective law in Nova Scotia, but not any longer. Here in New Brunswick, yes, if that comes back again, I will be happy to supply whatever information I can for that purpose.
Thank you.
Yes?
How do you feel about this notion that SMRs are going to recycle the so-called waste from point to pro, but yet no discussion on the waste that could in turn?
Well, the thing about small modular reactors is that all reactors, large or small, have the same problem. They produce this radioactive waste. There's no way you can get around it. You can't get energy from uranium without splitting the uranium atoms. That's the way you get it. And when you split the uranium atoms, you create these hundreds of radioactive waste byproducts. And the amount of high-level radioactive waste that is produced is directly proportional to the amount of energy you produce. So if you have, for example, 300 megawatt nuclear reactor running for 10 years, that's going to produce half as much waste as a 600 megawatt reactor running for 10 years. So if you know how long it's running and how much energy it's creating, that gives you a very good indication of how much radioactive waste is being produced. The problem is keeping that radioactive waste out of the environment. That's the problem. Now, they say that some reactors are safer than others. I have no doubt that's true. I know that some are more dangerous than others, so some have to be safer than others. But none of them are truly safe, because if you just drop a heavy bomb on one of these things, you spread the stuff far and wide. So the radioactive material, as a matter of fact, a nuclear physicist in Britain called Sir Brian Flowers wrote a Royal Commission report for the British government in 1976. He said that if nuclear power had been developed before World War II and had been widely deployed in Europe before World War II, then large parts of Europe today would be uninhabitable because of World War II. And the reason why is because those reactors would undoubtedly have been targeted as military targets, and when you drop a bomb on these things, all bets are off. You're going to release that radioactive content inside and spread it around. So that's the problem with all reactors, small or large. And unfortunately, in order to save money, they do away with some of the safety systems that they had previously because they're really expensive. You may have heard about a small modular reactor that's been authorized to be constructed in Ontario. It's called the BWRX-300. It's an American design, and it uses fuel that we would have to buy from out of the country because we can't use natural uranium in that reactor. Well, Ontario Power Generation, they haven't even built the thing. They're just digging the hole, right? But they've already estimated that the cost of that reactor, which is only 300 megawatts, that's half the size of LaPro, the cost of building that reactor will be around $7.7 billion, $7.7 billion. That makes it just about the most expensive electricity ever built in the world.
Or is that Darlington?
Right beside Darlington, right beside Darlington.
That's one of the major projects that has been authorized?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. That's correct. It's a BWR. BWR stands for boiling water reactor. Most of the reactors are not boiling in the world are not boiling water reactors. They're called pressurized water reactors. The 3 Fukushima reactors that melted down at Fukushima, they were all boiling water reactors. There are more boiling water reactors shut down than operating at the present time. And as my friend Sunil Nijhawan, whom we're going to visit today, in fact, in Nova Scotia, he worked in the nuclear industry for over 20 years as a safety analyst. And he's convinced that this reactor is quite unsafe, that it shouldn't be allowed, shouldn't be built. It's a problem. The actual cost of nuclear, according to even Wall Street, is much higher than the cost of wind with storage or solar with storage. There's a graph published by Lazard, a Wall Street firm, that shows that the highest cost, estimated cost for wind with solar and the highest estimated cost for solar with solar is far less than the lowest estimated cost for a nuclear of any kind. But nevertheless, there's a lot of people who are convinced that nuclear is the way to go. And here in New Brunswick, you have a government that is likewise convinced of that, and we have to wind it up now. We're going to move on to the second part.